Hello friends, the JOOLA Perseus mod TA-15 snuck onto the scene a few weeks ago with very little fanfare. But it soon gained a lot of attention because it was the original prototype of the Gen-3s that were famously delisted shortly after they were released. We all saw the pros using the mod right away after the Gen-3s were delisted, and rumor had it that they were a slightly toned down version of the Gen-3s in terms of power and pop. I've hit with this paddle now for 10 days, and in this video, I'll compare it directly to the Perseus Gen-3, dissect it to see if there really is less foam, and get into some destructive testing to see if there was a break-in during the time that I had it. Let's get into it. Okay, first a disclosure. I purchased this paddle personally, and JOOLA did not have any input on this video's production or get to preview it before it was published. I've never taken payments for any of my reviews, but if you use my affiliate link in the description below to purchase this paddle, I get a commission. JOOLA doesn't give discounts on this paddle right now, but you don't pay anything additional with the affiliate link, and it helps out this channel. Just like the Gen-3s before it, the mod TA-15 costs $280. All of the metrics are exactly the same as the Perseus 3, so if you want a detailed breakdown of those, go check out my original review of the Gen-3 line, which I'll put up on the screen right now. Static weight, swing weight, and twist weight were all nearly identical, as you can see in this chart. The mod did have a slightly higher balance point at the 88th percentile compared to the Perseus 3's 67th percentile. The mod comes in two thicknesses, 16mm and 14mm. I only looked at the 16mm, so that is the focus for the rest of this video. If you did like the 14mm Perseus 3, you can safely assume that the mod 14mm will play the same. In terms of technology, the mod uses the same propulsion core as advertised in the Gen-3s, so a layer of edge foam all the way around the perimeter of the paddle, like all thermoformed paddles, plus another layer of softer white foam between the edge foam and the polypropylene core along the top and the sides of the paddle. Again, I talked in depth about the propulsion core in my Gen-3 review, so go check that out if you want more. And this is where JOOLA got in trouble with USAP, who certifies paddles and who delisted all of the JOOLA Gen-3s, mostly because of the propulsion core. USAP claims that the propulsion core violates their equipment standards, which prohibit paddles from having a spring-like or trampoline effect, which results in the ball coming off too fast. USAP also claims that the production models of the Gen-3 paddles had more foam than the originally approved prototype, the mod TA-15. Okay, so I don't have one of the original mod prototypes sent to USAP, obviously, but I do have the production model of both the Perseus Gen-3 and the mod TA-15. I had already dissected the Gen-3 Perseus, and it looks like this. As advertised, there's a layer of white foam between the polymer core and the outer perimeter foam. So I also dissected the mod TA-15, and the question is there more foam in the mod than in the Gen-3? Here's what it looks like, and you can see when holding the mod side by side next to the Perseus 3, there's definitely not less foam in the mod. The two have what looks like the same amount of foam. The foam's hard to measure because it's thicker in some areas and thinner in others, but on average, it seems to be about 10mm thick for both paddles. So as far as I can tell, there's no difference in the core between the Gen-3s and the mod. To be clear, this isn't support of JOOLA or USAP in their statements during the ongoing litigation. JOOLA is claiming that the foam in the Gen-3 production models had no more than 1 extra millimeter of foam compared to the originally approved mod TA-15 prototype. But USAP is claiming that there actually was more foam in the production models. So we don't know who's correct here, and the only people who do are those who've looked at the original 2 mod TA-15s that were approved by USAP. Moving on, besides the graphics and colorways, the only difference I noticed between the mod and the Perseus 3 was the roughness of the surface texture. Most of the Gen 3s had extreme levels of grit, so much so that you could stick a paddle to your clothing and it would stay there. The texture on the mod is much more subdued, and it's more in line with most other raw carbon fiber textures. But as we'll see in the next section, the mod still gets great spin. I took the mod out for some drilling and for a few games before I ran the performance metrics, and from the start, it felt just like the Gen 3 Perseus. The power felt the same, the pop felt the same, and my first impression was that maybe the sweet spot felt slightly more narrow on the brand new mod compared to the Perseus 3, but when I weighted it up, similar to how I had the Gen 3, the sweet spot also felt the same. So the only difference was the slightly less aggressive spin on the mod. So it was no surprise when the metrics came back almost identical. Here's the breakdown for the mod on the left and the original Perseus 3 on the right. The boxes at the top of these graphics give you the raw numbers, and the radar chart on the bottom shows where these numbers fall in terms of percentiles for over 200 paddles in my database. High values over on the left side of the chart indicate more firepower, and high values on the top right of the chart relate to the paddle's control and forgiveness. Finally, the bottom of the chart tells you about maneuverability and hand speed. You can see right away that the mod is almost identical to the Gen 3. The biggest difference is spin, which is at the 100th percentile for the Gen 3 versus 83rd percentile for the mod. As I mentioned earlier, the mod has a slightly higher balance point. Otherwise, they're the same. What you're seeing on these charts are extremely heavy-hitting paddles that maximize power, pop, and spin. The top-tier spin also helps with control, but as you can see, the twist weight on both of these paddles is below average. The twist weight correlates with the width of the sweet spot, but as I'll discuss later in the modifications section, some perimeter weighting really helps broaden the sweet spot, which is already large on these paddles to begin with. The only other legal paddles on the market that compete with the firepower of the mod are the Gearbox Pro Power models. If we expand that into the paddles that aren't USAP approved for tournament play, there's also the new Diadem Hush, and of course, all of the models of the JOOLA Gen 3s. So the Perseus, Magnus, Scorpius, and Hyperion. I did find that this paddle's performance is enhanced with some strategic perimeter weighting. I added a 1-ounce slice speed cap to the base of the handle, replacing the stock cap. One caveat with doing this is that you might void the warranty of the paddle, so if this is a concern to you, do check with JOOLA before going down this path. The slice cap lowers the balance point, which increases wrist-dominant hand speed, making this paddle whippier. It also adds a bit of power and pop and gives the paddle more plow-through. I also added 3 grams of perimeter weighting at 4 and 8 o'clock, which helped to broaden the sweet spot and counterbalance the weight at the base of the handle. I found that this setup improved the overall feel of the paddle, making it more forgiving with a larger sweet spot, and it added a slight boost to power and pop. Not that this was needed, but it's not a bad side effect. So whipping through the ball on serves and drives with this setup really launched the ball, and I didn't find it hard to keep hard drives in with the spin that this paddle generates. I won't get into too many more details here about how the paddle plays because I've discussed it plenty with my original Gen 3 review, but putting aside concerns about whether or not this much power is good for the sport of pickleball, this paddle does play great, and it'll no doubt be popular, even with the stigma now surrounding the whole Gen 3 delisting and ongoing lawsuit between JOOLA and USAP. The mod hits real hard from the baseline, and I often found that my serves and drives snuck up on my opponents, and they had a hard time dealing with them. The paddle also has high pop, so attacks and counters at the kitchen were often one-shot winners. And normally with this much power, control suffers in a big way. This is true to some extent for the mod and the Gen 3s before it, which don't get as good of power as a soft, low-power paddle like, say, the Selkirk Lux. But given the power of the mod, the control is surprisingly decent. the top-tier spin helps, as does the oversized sweet spot, which is more forgiving than most Gen 2 paddles. Just like the Gen 3s, the mod also has a break-in period where it gets more powerful. I only played with this paddle for 10 days before it was sacrificed for this review, but I played a lot with it during that time, and I did notice it getting slightly hotter. I ran the metrics a second time after those 10 days of play, and there was a measurable increase in power and pop. There was also a slight decrease in spin, as is expected because all raw carbon fiber textures and other forms of grit wear down with use. Here's the before and after. So spin went from 2243 RPM to 2126. Serve speed gained 1.2 miles per hour, a 2% increase for power. And pop had a more modest gain of 0.5%. So overall, the firepower metric during these 10 days gained 1 point, going from 95 to 96. Nobody's really clear at this point where the break-in period ends for the JOOLA Gen 3s and now the mod. For example, the Gearbox Pro Power paddles also have a break-in period where they also become hotter, and mine gained a 6% increase in power over the first month, where it then leveled off and played at this level consistently afterwards. But we don't know where the JOOLA paddles stop breaking in or if they even stop at all. There were several reports and instances of cores crushing and breaking on the Gen 3s a few weeks after release, just before they were delisted. Even my own Colin John's Scorpius 3 broke after about 4 weeks of use. It started sounding funny, and after a slow break-in period where there was a subtle increase in power, suddenly overnight it became uncontrollable. The ball was just rocketing off the face. There was that typical crunching noise when you press your thumbs into the face of the paddle that's been core corrupted, and what seemed to be happening is that the polypropylene core was breaking down near that interface with the foam, probably because this is where the core flexes the most, which eventually broke down the structural integrity of the honeycomb cells. And this might be a design flaw of the propulsion core. It might be prone to break down quicker than other cores. Looking at the dissected mod, you can see a gap between the foam and the honeycomb in places. So the only thing holding the paddle together in these places is the facing layers, and I would imagine that these gaps are potentially weak points that are more likely to lead to core corruption. So all in all, the mod is just a Perseus 3 with a new paint job. I will say that I did like the subdued aesthetics of the mod. That minimalistic black and white design does look sleek, especially compared to the busy and bright colorways of the Gen 3s. Anyway, if you had a JOOLA Gen 3, particularly the Perseus, and you loved it, then you'll also love the mod. Putting aside the debate about whether or not this kind of power is bad for the game of pickleball, the mod is absolutely one of the best performing power paddles on the market. Just be aware of the caveats before you drop $300 on it. Firstly, the propulsion core might be prone to breaking. JOOLA does have a 6-month warranty if that gives you any peace of mind. There's also a bit of a stigma surrounding the Gen 3s and now by association the mod as a cheater paddle. I don't think this is fair because it's no more powerful than the other top performing power paddle, the Gearbox Pro Power. But to the average player who follows the headlines but isn't deep in the weeds with paddles, the perception is probably that if a whole series of paddles was delisted by the agency that regulates those paddles, then the same paddle with a different paint job shouldn't be allowed. So you might get a few sideways glances if you play with a mod at a tournament, whether or not that kind of thing bothers you. And the last caveat is whether or not the mod will also be delisted by USAP. Part of the stated reasons why USAP pulled the Gen 3s was the trampoline effect of the propulsion core and the thickness of the foam, which are all the same in the mod as in the delisted Gen-3s. To be clear, I'm not saying that this is somehow an underhanded move by JOOLA to release the mod with the same core as the delisted Gen-3s. Their stance through all of this has been that the Gen-3s should have never been delisted because they were the same as the original mod TA-15 that was originally approved by the USAP. Anyway, if I had to guess, I'd say that the USAP will not delist the mod, at least anytime soon, because it would create too much liability with the current lawsuit over the Gen-3 delisting. And even if it did happen, JOOLA has proven that they will refund the paddles, as happened with all of the Gen-3s. Okay, there you go. That was probably way more information than you ever wanted to know. I thought this video was going to be only a couple minutes long and would basically just be me saying the mod is the same as the Perseus 3, moving on. But then I started playing around with numbers and metrics, and then there were the charts, and now here we are past 10 minutes. But if you're still watching, bless you, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next video.